The lab smelled like burnt copper and old coffee, the way every lab worth anything smelled, and Dr. Katya Voss had stopped noticing it years ago. What she noticed now was the data. She leaned over the spectrometer, read out, and did not breathe. The numbers held. She checked them again. She checked them a third time, the way her old professor had drilled into her. Once for hope, once for doubt, once for truth. Psh. The truth was still there on the third read. Her hands were shaking when she finally stepped back from the bench and pressed both palms flat against the cold steel to make them stop. The formula worked. Or rather, the formula had finally been found. 6 years, 3 failed grant applications, 1 divorce, not that she counted it anymore. The loss of her position at the university, the 18 months of consulting for a pharmaceutical company she had despised on a molecular level, and then the Consortium's offer, which she had taken because it was the only door still open, and because the Consortium had resources she couldn't dream of on her own. 6 years of chasing a medieval alchemical notation that most of her colleagues had dismissed as metaphor, and here it sat. A compound that didn't break light so much as convince it to look elsewhere. Refractive nullification. Not invisibility in the science fiction sense, no bent light, no exotic matter, no hand-waving, just chemistry. A topical compound that caused the treated surface to register to photon receptor arrays, and experimentally to biological eyes, as statistically improbable to perceive. The brain looked and filed it as background. The sensor swept and logged nothing. You didn't vanish. You just stopped being worth noticing. She had been trying to explain distinction to people for years, and they kept calling it invisibility anyway. She had given up correcting them. The lab terminal pinged. Incoming signal, flagged priority red. Katya crossed to the terminal and read the header and felt the warmth in her chest. Go somewhere else. The Consortium, she answered. The face on the screen was not the administrator she usually reported to. It was someone older, someone she had only seen in briefings. A man named Drelak, whose title in the organizational chart was listed as liaison, but whose actual function she had always suspected was something colder. He was human-shaped in the way that some of the Consortium's senior partners were human-shaped. The proportions correct, but the stillness wrong, like a statue that had learned to blink. Dr. Voss, Drelak said. The monitoring system flagged anomalous power consumption in your lab. We've been watching your progress. She had known they watched. She had not known they watched this closely. I have a result, she said. Early stage, but the formula is confirmed viable. Was about to file a preliminary report. Yes. He paused in that particular Consortium way, where the pause meant something was being calculated rather than considered. You'll want to bring the compound and your primary documentation to Veth Station. We've arranged transit for you. 48 hours. Veth Station. She knew the name. She had never been there. Consortium Coordination Hub. Technically neutral ground. Technically. The word technically doing a great deal of structural work in that sentence. Outside the jurisdiction of the treaty compact. It orbited nothing in particular, which was the point. The Nobel Review Board is expecting a preliminary submission in 3 weeks, she said, because it was true, and because she needed to say something that was not yes. The Nobel Review Board will still be there, Drelak said. The situation at Veth Station will not wait. She looked at the readout. 6 years. The numbers that had held on the third check. What situation, she asked. Drelak smiled. It was a practiced expression, and it reached no further than his mouth. Transit has been arranged, Doctor. 48 hours. The channel closed. Norman Voss was not a scientist. He was, by most metrics, the opposite of a scientist. He fixed things. Specifically, he fixed the kind of things that scientists broke. Atmospheric processors, environmental seals, the mechanical dignity of equipment that had been subjected to people who thought of it as furniture, rather than machinery. He had been doing this on Veth Station for 2.5 years, which was how long it took to accumulate enough debt that leaving felt impossible, and staying felt necessary. He was also Katya's brother, though they had not spoken in 4 years. The message she sent said, I'm coming to the station. I might need help. I don't know yet. He read it 3 times. Once for hope, once for doubt, once for truth. On the third red, he sent back, "I'll be here," and went back to replacing a pressure coupling in Section 9 that someone had tried to fix with what appeared to be dental bonding compound. She arrived on the 47th hour. She was carrying a hard case that she did not check through the station's intake scanners, which was possible because the Consortium's transit paperwork had pre-cleared her through a customs channel that didn't require physical inspection. He knew this because he had friends in logistics, the way everyone on a station like Veth developed friends in logistics. Because logistics was how the place breathed. "You look terrible," he said when she came through the corridor. "Thank you," she said. "I worked very hard on it." She looked at his hands. "Have grease under your fingernails." "I have grease everywhere. It's a station." "What's in the case?" 6 years of my life." She set it down on the bench in the corner of his workspace and looked at it for a moment. "And possibly the reason I'm about to have a very bad time." He had learned, over the years, to trust the way his sister described things. She didn't catastrophize. She didn't understate either. If she said possibly a very bad time, she meant she had mapped the probabilities, and bad was the weighted average. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The Consortium's primary research hub on Veth Station was in the forward ring, behind a security threshold that required both biometric confirmation and a signed access declaration that came with 3 pages of non-disclosure clauses. Katya had been directed to Sublevel 4, a long white corridor of conference spaces and laboratory annexes that smelled aggressively of nothing, which was its own kind of smell. She went alone. She had argued with Norman about this for 40 minutes, and won by pointing out that if she disappeared into a secure corridor with her brother in tow, they would have leverage over both of them, and she preferred to keep him as an option. He had said. An option for what, she had said, "I don't know yet." The meeting was in Conference Suite 4C. There were 4 of them waiting. Drellock, 2 individuals she didn't recognize whose function would become clear, and a third she recognized immediately and wished she didn't. Dr. Jacques Gervais. He was 83 years old and appeared to be 70, because he had the kind of habits of him that good genetics and better supplements produced. He had published 62 papers in the field of photonic interaction chemistry, 14 of which she had cited. He had also been a Consortium affiliate for longer than she had been alive, which she had learned only 6 months ago, and which had sat in her chest like a stone ever since. Because it meant that some of his earlier work, the foundational work she had built on, had been done inside a framework she would not have agreed to if she'd been given the choice. "Katya," Gervais said, with the warmth of a man who was genuinely happy to see her, and had not examined why that warmth should feel complicated. "Doctor," she said. Drellock gestured to a chair. She sat and placed the hard case on the table and did not open it. "You've confirmed the formula," Drellock said. It was not a question, a preliminary confirmation. "Compound requires further." "The compound is what we need," Drellock said. "Specifically, we need a quantity sufficient to treat a strike team of 46 individuals and their primary equipment loadout. We need it in 72 hours." The room was very quiet. Katya looked at Gervais. Gervais looked at the table. "A strike team," she said. "The Treaty Compact's verification installation at Marin Point is scheduled for decommission in 90 days. Before that decommission, the verification logs will be transmitted to the full Compact Council. There are records in those logs that the Consortium's partners have a significant interest in seeing removed before that transmission occurs." She understood. She understood with the clarity of a calculation that runs clean on the first check. And she wished she didn't. "You want me to help you send invisible soldiers into a treaty facility," she said, "to destroy records that would presumably implicate the Consortium in whatever those records document. We want you to complete your contractual deliverable," Drellock said. "The application of the compound is not your concern. The Nobel Prize Review Board. The Nobel Committee reviews publicly submitted science. This work has not been publicly submitted. Under your contract, it will not be publicly submitted." She had read the contract. She had read it the way she read data. For what it said, and for what it was careful not to say. She had thought the clause about publication rights was about timing. She understood now that it was about ownership. Gervais finally looked up. Katya, I know what you're thinking, do you? I thought the same things. Early on. He had the voice of a man who had made peace with something. The work is real. What we discovered. It's real, regardless of who uses it. The science doesn't become less true because. Don't, she said quietly. She was not angry. She was past the point where anger was the appropriate instrument. Don't tell me the science is separate from what it's used for. That's a lie you've been telling yourself for 40 years. And I'm not going to start telling it now. The two individuals she hadn't recognized had shifted positions slightly. She noticed this. She cataloged it. You have 48 hours to consider your options, Drelak said. Brother is currently employed on this station. His contract contains a cooperation clause with Consortium security operations that I suspect he was not fully advised of at signing. There it was. She stood. She picked up the hard case. I'll think about it, she said, which was the only true thing she could say in that room, because she was already thinking, and had been thinking since the channel closed 2 days ago. And the thinking had led her to a place she needed Norman to reach before the 48 hours ran out. Norman listened. He did not interrupt. He had learned this from her. The discipline of receiving information before responding to it, which was harder than it sounded and more useful than almost anything else she had ever taught him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You already have a plan." "I have the outline of a plan," she said. "I need you to fill in the parts that require knowing how this station works." "What parts?" "The parts about how a person stops being worth noticing," she said, and she opened the case. The compound worked on sensors the same way it worked on eyes. This was the part that had taken her 4 years to understand. The original medieval formula. The alchemical notation that her colleagues had dismissed as metaphor had described it in terms of spiritual philosophy rather than chemistry. But the underlying principle was accurate. It didn't hide you. It convinced the observer's pattern recognition system that the observation wasn't worth filing. The brain, the camera, the proximity sensor, they all ran on the same fundamental logic. Stimulus in, threat assessment out. The compound interrupted that logic at the assessment stage. She had enough compound for approximately 12 treatments. The formula was in her head and in the hard case. The hard case also contained a copy of her full research documentation on an encrypted drive. And a secondary copy she had split across 3 separate locations on the station, which she had done before the meeting, because she had known what the meeting would be, and because she was a scientist and scientists made backups. 46 soldiers, Norman said. We can't treat 46 people. We don't need to. We need to treat 2, she explained. He listened. He had 3 objections, 2 of which were practical. One of which was the kind of objection that came from caring about someone and needing to say it out loud even when the answer was already decided. She answered the practical ones. She acknowledged the third. If this goes wrong, he said, it'll go wrong in the right direction, she said, which is the best we can aim for. He thought about this. He had spent 2.5 years on a station run by an organization whose contract clauses contained things he hadn't been fully advised of. And he had mostly managed this by not thinking about it, which was a common solution, and not a good one. He was tired of it. The data center is in the aft section, he said. I know a route that maintenance uses that doesn't run through the security threshold. It's tight. Very tight. Profile environments only. Good. The Consortium's communication relay is on the exterior hull. Getting to it means an EVIA, which means getting into the EVIA prep bay, which means... I know what it means, she said. I have a 12-hour window before Drellik expects an answer. That's the window. Norman looked at his hands. The grease under his fingernails. He had been fixing things for 2.5 years in a place that was, he now understood clearly, fundamentally broken in a way no pressure coupling swap was going to address. All right, he said. The compound went on like sunscreen. This was something she had noted in her research files with a certain dry satisfaction. All that alchemical mystique. and the application method was a brush-on gel that smelled faintly of citrus. She had formulated it that way deliberately, because she thought it was funny, and also because the scent signature helped distinguish treated surfaces from untreated ones in a laboratory setting. They applied it carefully, methodically, face, hands, neck, the reflective portions of clothing. Norman had a small maintenance tablet that he treated as well, which would appear as a signal ghost rather than a device in the station's tracking grid. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like I put on sunscreen," she said. "That's it?" "That's it." She checked the mirror in his washroom. She could see herself clearly. The compound didn't affect self-perception. Your own visual system adapted to the treated surface because it was constantly receiving proprioceptive confirmation of your existence. The sensors won't log us. Eyes will slide past. If someone is actively looking for something in exactly our location, they might catch movement. No one will be actively looking. "Because we look like background," he said. "Because we look like we're not worth noticing." She turned from the mirror. "It wears off in about 4 hours. We need to be done in 3. The maintenance corridor was exactly as tight as Norman had warned. She moved behind him, through passages that smelled of recycled air and metal, conduit bundles running overhead like the arteries of something enormous and sleeping. He moved through them with the ease of someone who had spent 2 years learning the physical grammar of a place, knowing which junctions required a half crouch, which sections had the floor sensors disabled because they generated false alerts, where the automated sweeps had a 4-second gap in their rotation pattern. She had spent 6 years in laboratories. He had spent 2.5 years in maintenance corridors. The two kinds of knowing were not the same, but they were compatible. The data center was a cold room the size of a generous closet. Norman had a maintenance override for the environmental systems that let them in without triggering the access log. The Consortium's internal architecture, she had learned from her 6 years of working within it, was built for the assumption that adversaries would come from outside. The possibility that the people who had been doing the work might someday want to preserve it. That specific threat model had not been well designed for. She located the primary data nodes. She had brought a contact transfer device, which she had built in the 4 hours between Drellak's message and her arrival at the station, from components in her lab that no one had thought to inventory because they didn't look like what they were. She had assembled it while thinking about 6 years of work and what it was for and what she wanted it to do in the world. And the thinking had clarified things the way good experiments clarified things. It told her what she already knew, just with better precision. The transfer took 11 minutes. When it was done, she had a complete copy of the formula, the supporting documentation, and, because she had taken the time to look, a substantial subset of the Consortium's internal research archive, including the work that Gervais had done under their umbrella, the work that predated her own. The work whose publication had been, she now confirmed, systematically delayed or suppressed when its applications had Consortium utility. She felt many things about this. She filed them for later. The way you filed a result you didn't have time to analyze in the moment. "Done," she told Norman. "Relay," he said. The EVA Prep Bay required a Level 3 access badge that Norman did not have. He had, however, spent 2.5 years knowing the person who managed EVA equipment allocation, a woman named Selah, who had her own complicated feelings about the Consortium's cooperation clauses, and who had, when Norman had asked her a carefully worded hypothetical 2 hours earlier, responded with an equally carefully worded answer that had contained the words Bay 4 has a scheduled maintenance, EVA logged in progress since yesterday, and nobody checks in progress entries, and nothing else. Bay 4 was unoccupied. There was a maintenance suit, in Norman's size, because Norman had filed a scheduled maintenance EVA 3 weeks ago and not completed it, which was logged as pending, and nobody checked pending entries either. The hull was cold and very still. Veth Station turned slowly beneath her boots, and the stars were everywhere. The kind of everywhere that stopped being poetic about 30 seconds in and became simply factual. They moved along the hull in tethered single file. Norman ahead because he knew the surface. Katya behind because she was carrying the relay transmitter. The Consortium's external communications relay was a cluster of dishes and signal boosters mounted on the station's dorsal array. She had studied its architecture from schematics she'd accessed through the data center. Treaty Compact's emergency public channel ran on a frequency that was technically accessible to any transmitter with sufficient broadcast power, which this relay had in abundance. Because the Consortium's communication infrastructure was built to reach a long way, she connected the transmitter. She had prepared the data package with headers that identified its origin, its content, and its provenance. The Treaty Compact's verification protocol would receive it, hash it, and distribute it to council members simultaneously. The same architecture that made it hard to forge also made it hard to suppress once delivered. She initiated the broadcast. It ran for 40 seconds. When it finished, the relay returned to its normal function, and there was no log of the broadcast because the maintenance EVA authentication had shilted the session, and there was no record of her presence on the hull because the compound was still active, and the hull cameras had been cataloging her as an artifact rather than a subject. She disconnected the transmitter. She looked at the stars for one moment, 40 seconds, 6 years, and 40 seconds, and the work was out in the world, now in the way she had always meant it to be, attributed to its true authors, documented completely, available to every researcher who wanted to build on it rather than weaponize it. The Nobel Committee would receive a copy. So would 7 universities. So would the verification installation at Marin Point, which now had a complete record of what the Consortium had filed internally about the strike team request, timestamped and authenticated. She had been thinking about the distinction between invisible and not worth noticing since she had confirmed the formula. An invisible thing is hidden by force. A thing that's not worth noticing disappears because the observer decides it's irrelevant. The Consortium had spent 40 years treating human scientists like background, like infrastructure, like components in a system whose purposes were determined elsewhere. She had borrowed their own principle. She had made herself not worth noticing, and in the same move, made everything they wanted hidden very, very visible. Norman tapped her shoulder. Time. She followed him back along the hull, hand over hand on the tether line, the station turning slowly, the stars doing what stars did. They were back inside and out of the suits, with 22 minutes to spare before the compound wore off. Cecila was in the prep bay when they returned. She looked at them without looking at them, which was a skill of its own that had nothing to do with chemistry. Eva, she said. Maintenance, Norman said. Cecila nodded. She went back to her inventory manifest. Called at hour 47. He had the expression of a man who had received information recently that had reorganized his priorities and was managing the reorganization in real time, which was visible in the quality of his stillness. Less calculated now, more careful. Voss, he said. Drelak, she said. It appears that a data package originating from Veth Station's external relay was broadcast to the Treaty Compact's emergency channel approximately 2 hours ago. I heard about that, she said. Sounds like a significant breach. The investigation is ongoing. He paused. Your contract with the Consortium. My contract contains a clause about publication rights, she said, and a cooperation clause my brother was apparently not fully advised of. I've sent both to the Treaty Compact's Legal Review Board, along with the rest of the documentation. They'll sort it out. She paused. I suspect that process will take some time, long enough for me to file with the Nobel Review Board, which I'll be doing from a location outside the Consortium's transit network. Drelak was quiet. Compound works, she said. That's true whether you use it or not. What I've made sure of is that everyone gets to use it, or rather, everyone gets to know about it and decide for themselves. That was always what it was for. She ended the call. Shh. Norman was sitting on the bench where she had set the case down when she arrived. He had a cup of coffee that had gone cold while they were on the hull, and he was holding it with both hands anyway. The way you held something warm. even after the warmth was gone. "Now what?" he said. "Now we leave." She picked up the hard case. Lighter now, in a way that had nothing to do with weight. "I know someone at the Compact's transit office who owes me a peer review." He looked at the case. "The formula's really out there now. They can't pull it back?" "It's in 43 servers on 3 different networks," she said. "It's been confirmed by independent hash verification. The Consortium could destroy every copy they have, and it wouldn't matter." She looked at the case herself for a moment. Science doesn't stay in the box. That's the whole point of it. Someone does the work, and then the work belongs to the question, not to the person who funded it. He stood. He looked at his hands. The grease was still there. Would probably still be there tomorrow, and the day after, because that was the kind of work that left marks. He thought about 2.5 years of fixing things in corridors no one thought to watch. "You know," he said, "when you sent that message, I thought you needed help with something technical." "This was technical," she said. "This was the least technical thing I have ever done." "The compound application was technical," she said, with the specific slight smile that had been the same since she was 12 years old. Everything else was just knowing which parts of the station nobody was watching. He drained the cold coffee, set the cup down, picked up his bag, which he had packed the night before, because she had been right about the options, and he had thought about it and come to the same answer. "Transit terminal," he said. "Bay 12, or I know a maintenance route." "Bay 12, she said. "We don't need to be invisible anymore." They walked through the station in the light, and nobody stopped them. And if anyone noticed them, it was only in the way you noticed people moving with purpose through a place. Logged and released, present and then gone, the way all things eventually go when they've done what they came to do. Find them in 43 servers, on 3 different networks, the formula held. The numbers stayed true on the third red. The work existed in the world now, out of the box, the way work was always meant to exist. Not as a weapon, not as a secret, but as a question given to everyone who wanted to answer it. It was, after all, what it had been for from the beginning. She had just needed to make sure the right people could see it.